Imagine a world without schools, a place where everything you ever learned came from whispered stories, songs sung around fires, or lessons passed from parent to child, all held in the fragile vault of human memory. No textbooks, no classrooms, no shared records of what we discovered or dreamed. For thousands of years, that was the reality. Knowledge lived and died with people. It shifted with every telling, faded with every generation. Then, something extraordinary happened. In the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, along the fertile banks of the Nile, and in the budding city-states of Greece, the world's first schools emerged, and they didn't just teach people how to read and write. They reinvented what it meant to know, to learn, and to remember. They turned memory from something personal and perishable into something permanent, powerful, and shared. What would it have felt like to witness that shift, to see symbols pressed into wet clay for the very first time, not as decoration but as deliberate records, lists of grain, names of kings, prayers to the gods? For the first time, human thought could outlive the thinker. Ideas could travel across space and time. This was nothing short of a revolution in consciousness, and it all began in places called Aduber, the ancient scribble schools of Sumer, where students, as young as 8, devoted years of their lives to mastering the art of cuneiform. They weren't just learning a skill, they were learning how to build civilization itself. In this video, we're going to travel back more than 5,000 years to walk the dusty courtyards of those first schools. We'll meet the scribes who held the future in their hands, explore how writing transformed law, science, and identity, and see how the earliest curricula set patterns we still follow today. This isn't just a story about education. It's about how humans learned to externalize memory, to hold knowledge outside ourselves, in clay, in stone, in scrolls, and in doing so, expanded the very boundaries of what we could achieve together. You're about to see how the classroom, one of humanity's oldest inventions, helped write the story of us all. Picture this. The air is thick with the heat of a Mesopotamian afternoon, somewhere around 3,500 years before the Common Era. Inside a modest building made of sun-dried mud brick, a group of young boys, some no older than 8 or 9, sit cross-legged on the floor, their eyes fixed not on a teacher, but on a slab of wet clay resting in their palms. In their hands, they hold a reed stylus, and with painstaking concentration, they press wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface. This is an Aduber, a tablet house, and it is quite possibly the first formal school in human history. Here, in the heart of Sumer, education was not about reading stories or discussing ideas. It was a grueling, years-long apprenticeship in the most powerful technology of its time, writing. These students were training to become scribes, the human engines of the world's first great bureaucracies. Their classroom was a factory for memory, and their product was permanence. The historian Samuel Noah Kramer called these places the cradle of structured learning, noting that they emerged not from a desire for philosophy or art, but from an urgent, practical need. As cities grew, trade expanded, and temples amassed wealth, society became too complex to run on spoken words and fragile memories alone. Who owned which field? How much grain was paid in taxes? What were the laws handed down from the king? All of this needed to be recorded, standardized, and stored. That is why the Aduber was born. The curriculum was relentless, focused overwhelmingly on mastering cuneiform, the intricate script of wedges and lines that could capture the Sumerian language. Students spent years copying word lists, mathematical tables, and legal phrases, their fingers cramping, their minds straining to memorize hundreds of distinct signs. Discipline was severe. Clay tablets from the period describe students being beaten for speaking out of turn, for poor penmanship, or for arriving late. One ancient text even complains, "The door monitor said, 'Why are you late?' and caned me." This was not education for personal enrichment, it was training for civic function. Those who graduated entered a privileged class, becoming the administrators, accountants, and priests who kept the machinery of state and religion running smoothly. They were the living link between the spoken word and the written record, the first professionals whose job was to externalize human knowledge. In doing so, they initiated a profound shift in human consciousness. Knowledge was no longer something fleeting, changing with each telling around a fire. It could now be fixed in clay, compared, corrected, and built upon. A law written down was a law that could be enforced consistently. A contract inscribed was a promise that could not be easily broken. A prayer recorded was a ritual that could be repeated with perfect accuracy for generations. The Aduber did not just teach writing, it created a system for preserving truth itself, setting a template that would be followed, in one form or another, by every school that came after. But before writing could reshape the world, humanity relied on a different kind of classroom, the human voice itself. For tens of thousands of years, knowledge lived in stories, songs, and poems, passed from one generation to the next in a living, breathing chain of memory. This was the realm of oral tradition, a world without fixed texts where a storyteller was not just a reciter but a recreator. Imagine a dark night, a community gathered around a fire, and an elder beginning a tale of heroes and gods. With each telling, the story might shift slightly, adapting to the audience, the occasion, or the teller's own insights. The details were fluid, the endings SOMETIMES Chinese letter, and the knowledge it carried was deeply personal and contextual. This was a dynamic, participatory form of learning, where memory was not about perfect recall but about connection and meaning. Great epics like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were born in this oral world, composed and recomposed over centuries by bards who held thousands of lines of poetry in their minds, using rhythmic patterns and formulaic phrases as mental scaffolding. This was an incredible feat of memory, but it was also a fragile system. Knowledge could be lost with the death of a single elder, altered with every migration, or simplified over time to fit the constraints of human recall. The rise of writing and the schools that taught it introduced a radically different principle, fixation. When a story or law was written down, it became frozen in time. The version on the tablet or scroll was now the official version, the one to be copied, studied, and preserved without change. We see this powerfully with those same Homeric epics. For generations, they flowed and changed in the oral tradition. But once they were transcribed onto papyrus, a process scholars believe began in Athens around the 6th century BCE, they began to solidify. The written word became the authority. In the new scribble schools, students were no longer encouraged to improvise or adapt a tale. Their goal was to achieve perfect textual accuracy, to copy the lines exactly as they appeared on the master copy. This was a profound shift in priority from the personalized performance to the standardized text. The burden of remembering every detail was lifted from the human mind and placed onto an external object. This externalization of memory was perhaps one of the most significant cognitive revolutions in human history. It freed up mental bandwidth, allowing thinkers to stop focusing so intensely on retention and start focusing on analysis. You no longer had to memorize every law. You could look it up, You didn't have to hold the entire genealogy of a king in your head. You could consult a written list. This allowed for knowledge to become more complex and cumulative. A scholar could now look at two different written accounts of an event, compare them, identify contradictions, and engage in criticism. They could build upon the ideas of past thinkers without those ideas being distorted through generations of retelling. This transition from the fluidity of speech to the fixity of text did more than change how we stored information. It began to rewire the very way we think. Oral cultures tend to think in terms of stories, metaphors, and concrete events. Written cultures, by contrast, can develop more abstract, logical, and analytical forms of thought. It's much easier to deconstruct an argument, to examine the precise meaning of a word, or to follow a complex chain of logic when you can see the words laid out permanently in front of you. You can scroll back, reread, and compare. This fostered the development of skills that became the absolute bedrock of formal education: logic, analysis, and critical questioning. The very act of silent reading, which emerged later, encouraged an internal dialogue, a private space for critical thought that was less influenced by the communal pressure of the group. The schoolhouse, with its emphasis on copying, reading, and analyzing texts, became the training ground for this new kind of mind. It was teaching people not just what to think, but fundamentally how to think, with a precision, a permanence, and a capacity for scrutiny that the oral world, for all its beauty and power, could never fully achieve on its own. But how did humanity make that colossal leap from spoken sounds to visible signs? The story begins not with poetry or philosophy, but with the most mundane of human needs: accounting. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, as cities like Uruk grew around 3500 BCE, temples became vast economic centers, storing and redistributing grain, oil, and wool. The priests and administrators faced a problem. How could they keep track of it all? Human memory was too fallible for such vast quantities. Their ingenious solution was to create small clay tokens, each shaped to represent a specific item: a cone for a measure of grain, an ovoid for a jar of oil. These tokens were sealed in hollow clay balls, and on the outside they would impress markings to show what was inside. Then, a brilliant realization dawned. Why make the tokens at all if the impressions on the clay ball conveyed the same information? They began to simply press a stylus into a flat clay tablet to make those same marks. This was the humble birth of cuneiform. The word itself means wedge-shaped, named for the distinctive triangular marks made by the corner of a cut reed pressed into soft clay. At first, these signs were simple pictograms, literal drawings of the objects they represented. A drawing of a head meant head, but language is full of ideas you cannot draw, like life or God or justice. To capture these, the system evolved through Rebu's principle, using the sign for a concrete word to represent a sound. For instance, the sign for water in Sumerian was pronounced A. So that same sign could now be used to represent the sound A, in other words, completely detached from its original meaning. This was the revolutionary shift from a script that could only show things to a script that could record speech itself. A parallel evolution was happening along the Nile. Egyptian hieroglyphics, or sacred carvings, developed around the same time, likely inspired by trade contact with Mesopotamia. But while cuneiform became increasingly abstract, reduced to efficient wedge patterns, hieroglyphs retained their beautiful pictorial nature, often carved majestically into stone for temples and tombs. They operated on a similar yet distinct triple principle. Some signs were logograms representing a whole word like sun. Others were phonograms representing consonant sounds, just like the Rebu's principle in cuneiform. And a third set, determinatives, were silent signs placed at the end of a word to clarify its category, like indicating that the preceding signs referred to a type of wood or a foreign name. This made hieroglyphs an incredibly flexible and sophisticated system, but also a dauntingly complex one to learn, with over 700 distinct signs in common use. Mastering either of these systems was a Herculean task that consumed years of a young student's life. In the Aduber, a scribble student wouldn't just learn the signs, they had to internalize them through relentless, monotonous repetition. They practiced by copying long lists, lists of professions, lists of cities, lists of animals, lists of gods. These were essentially the world's first dictionaries and encyclopedias, tools for standardizing knowledge across the kingdom. A single sign might have multiple pronunciations and meanings depending on context, and a single sound could be written with different signs. The process was grueling. A surviving school text from ancient Sumer paints a vivid picture of a student's long day, from dawn until dusk, filled with copying and recitation, all under the watchful eye and ready cane of the schoolmaster. The reward for this year's long ordeal, however, was immense. Literacy was the ultimate social elevator, granting entry into the most powerful and prestigious class in society. A skilled scribe could become a government official, a temple accountant, a military recorder, or a royal correspondent. They were the indispensable administrators without whom the state could not function. This newfound power to fix language in clay and stone had its most profound impact on the concept of law. Before written codes, justice was often arbitrary, based on the memory of elders or the whim of a local chieftain. A ruling one year might be forgotten or ignored the next. Writing changed everything. The most famous example is the Code of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, inscribed on a towering black stone stele around 1750 BCE. Here, for all to see, were nearly 300 laws covering everything from commerce and property to marriage and assault. The principle of an eye for an eye was literally set in stone. This was a monumental achievement. For the first time, the law was not a vague tradition but a visible, permanent, and public standard. It could be disseminated to distant cities, ensuring a citizen in Babylon was subject to the same rules as a citizen in a far-off province. It limited the power of individual judges to make capricious rulings. It created a culture of consistency and predictability, which is the very foundation of justice and a stable society. Knowledge in the form of law was no longer locked away in the memories of a privileged few. It was externalized, objectified, and made available, at least in principle, as a shared resource for the entire community. This act of writing down the rules didn't just record society. It actively built a new, more coherent kind of society, one where collective memory and agreed-upon principles could shape daily life for centuries to come. In the rigidly structured societies of the ancient world, the scribe stood apart, a figure of immense prestige and quiet power. While kings and pharaohs might command armies and priests might speak for the gods, it was the scribe who wielded the stylus that made their authority permanent. To be literate in a world where 99% of the population was to possess a form of magic. An Egyptian text known as the Satire of the Trades, used in schools to motivate young students, drives this point home with brutal clarity. It doesn't merely suggest that being a scribe is a good job. It systematically disparages every other profession to elevate the scribe's status. The text describes the potter, who is smeared with soil like one among whom the dead are laid. The metalworker, with fingers like a crocodile's, who stank more than fish roe. The soldier sent to distant lands, thirsty and his stomach sick. In contrast, the scribe is presented as the ultimate master of his own destiny. The text proclaims, behold, there is no profession free of a boss, except for the scribe. He is the boss. This wasn't just career advice. It was a powerful ideological tool reinforcing that literacy was the only true path to a life of dignity, comfort, and influence. The scribe was the indispensable node in the network of civilization, the only one who could read the king's decrees, tally the harvest for taxation, record the offerings at the temple, and draft legal contracts. Without them, the entire administrative and religious order would simply cease to function. This privileged position came with immense responsibility and, consequently, a carefully guarded exclusivity. Education in these early formal schools was not a universal right. It was a strategic investment by the state and the temple, reserved almost exclusively for the sons of the elite, the offspring of officials, wealthy merchants, and of course, scribes themselves. The grueling years of study, the cost of materials like papyrus or wax tablets, and the social connections required for entry created a formidable barrier. This intentional restriction served a dual purpose. On one hand, it concentrated intellectual power in the hands of a small, loyal class who could be trusted to manage the complexities of the state. They became the guardians of orthodoxy, ensuring that religious texts were copied correctly, that royal propaganda was disseminated accurately, and that the legal and economic systems operated to the benefit of the ruling class. On the other hand, it created a powerful, self-perpetuating social hierarchy. Literacy became the key that unlocked wealth, status, and political power, and by keeping that key for themselves, the elite ensured their dominance would continue for generations. A peasant might be strong, a craftsman might be skilled, but without the ability to read, write, and calculate, they could never challenge the established order or access the levers of true control. This dynamic transformed the earliest schools from simple centers of learning into sophisticated instruments of social and political engineering. They were factories for producing a very specific kind of person, a loyal functionary who would uphold the existing system. The curriculum was meticulously designed not to foster independent thought or critical inquiry, but to instill obedience, precision, and a deep reverence for tradition. Students spent years copying approved texts, memorizing standardized lists, and practicing formulaic compositions. They learned to write a letter to a superior with the proper deference, to record a transaction with exacting accuracy, and to copy a religious hymn without a single error. Innovation or personal interpretation was not just discouraged, it was often punished. The goal was perfect replication, not creative expansion. In this way, the school system acted as a powerful filter, ensuring that the knowledge necessary to run the empire was preserved and transmitted, but only to those who would use it to maintain the status quo. The very act of defining what knowledge was worth preserving, the king's chronicles, the temple's rituals, the state's laws, and what was not, the songs of the farmers, the stories of the artisans, was a profound exercise of power. It meant that the official memory of the civilization, the one that would be passed down through the centuries, was the memory of the elite, recorded by their own hand-picked scribes. This foundational link between literacy, power, and social control is a legacy that has echoed through the millennia, influencing who gets educated and to what end, from the medieval monasteries to the ivy-covered universities of the modern world. The ancient scribe, hunched over his tablet, was not just a recorder of history, he was quite deliberately its gatekeeper. Stepping inside one of these ancient classrooms, we would find a world far removed from our modern ideals of creativity and self-expression. The daily rhythm of an Aduber was governed by one overarching principle, a relentless, flawless repetition. The curriculum was not designed to inspire original thought, but to forge a perfect copyist, a human recording device who could accurately transcribe the vital information that kept the state running. A typical day for a young scribe in training began before dawn and stretched long into the evening, a marathon of mental and physical exertion centered around a single object, the clay tablet. The first and most critical skill was mastering the cuneiform signs themselves. Students didn't learn by understanding the language's underlying principles first. They learned by doing, copying sign after sign, list after list, until their hands could form the wedges automatically. We know this in intimate detail because thousands of these practice tablets have survived, offering us a direct window into the ancient classroom. We can see a teacher's elegant, expertly drawn characters on the left side of a tablet, and on the right a student's shaky, uncertain attempts to replicate them. On some tablets, we can even trace the student's progress over time, the signs gradually becoming more confident and precise with each passing day. The content of these exercises reveals the intensely practical nature of this early education. Students spent countless hours copying vast standardized lists known as lexical lists. These were the textbooks of their day. There were lists of trees and wooden objects, lists of animals, lists of cities and their patron deities, lists of professions ranked in order of importance. One famous list, called the Hieroglyphs, was an enormous compilation of economic and legal terms that functioned as a primitive encyclopedia and dictionary combined. The goal was to build a standardized vocabulary that every scribe across the land would share, ensuring that a contract written in one city would be understood in exactly the same way in another. This was the birth of a standardized curriculum, a body of knowledge deemed essential for every educated person to know. Alongside writing, mathematics formed the other pillar of their training. Students learned to calculate areas of fields, volumes of grain silos, and interest rates on loans. They solved complex algebraic problems, all rendered in the clumsy medium of wet clay. A surviving tablet might show a word problem about dividing a field among several brothers, followed by the student's step-by-step calculations and final answer. Accuracy was everything. A single miscalculation in a tax record or a building project could have serious real-world consequences. To enforce this rigorous standard, pedagogy was uncompromisingly strict. Discipline was harsh and immediate. Corporal punishment was not just common, it was a fundamental tool of instruction. School texts from the period are surprisingly candid about this. One composition, often called A Schoolboy's Day, describes a student being caned by at least 7 different officials for various offenses: for being late, for speaking out of turn, for not standing up respectfully, for having poor handwriting, and for making mistakes in his work. The text reads like a litany of misery. The man in charge of rules said, "Why did you talk without permission?" and caned me. The man in charge of the gate said, "Why did you go out without permission?" and caned me. This constant threat of physical punishment was meant to instill not only knowledge but also obedience, discipline, and respect for authority. The ideal graduate was not a free thinker but a reliable, efficient, and loyal functionary. This methodical, repetition-based approach was a double-edged sword for human intellectual development. On one hand, it was phenomenally effective for its primary purpose, the deep, almost unshakable internalization of a complex system of knowledge. By writing a sign hundreds of times, a student moved it from short-term memory into muscle memory and long-term recall. This made the recall of information incredibly reliable, which was essential in a society where a scribe's work underpinned the economy, the legal system, and religious practice. It preserved the Sumerian language and its vast literary and administrative tradition with remarkable fidelity for centuries. On the other hand, this system profoundly privileged conformity over creativity. It valued the perfect replication of the past over the invention of the new. A student was rewarded for getting it exactly right. not for having a novel idea or a different perspective. This established a powerful precedent that would echo through educational history for millennia, the idea that the primary goal of learning is the accurate absorption and reproduction of a fixed canon of knowledge handed down from authority. It was a system brilliantly engineered for preservation and stability, but one that could also, at times, act as a brake on innovation and critical questioning, creating a tension between tradition and progress that remains at the heart of educational debates even today. While the Aduber of Mesopotamia focused primarily on training scribes for the bureaucracy, another, even more profound educational institution was taking shape just across the sands, one that saw knowledge not merely as a tool for administration, but as a sacred bridge between the earthly and the divine. In the shadow of towering ziggurats and along the hallowed corridors of Egyptian temples, learning was undergoing a remarkable fusion. Here, the temple was not just a place of worship, it was the ultimate house of life, a term the ancient Egyptians themselves used, per ankh, to describe these vibrant centers where the spiritual and the scientific were woven into a single, inseparable tapestry of understanding. To walk into one of these temple complexes was to enter a universe of knowledge. The air would be thick with the scent of incense and papyrus, humming with the low chant of hymns being memorized and the intense, quiet discussion of celestial patterns. In one chamber, a senior priest might be guiding novices through the intricate steps of a ritual to honor a god, ensuring every gesture, every syllable, was perfect to maintain cosmic order. In the very next room, those same novices might be hunched over a tablet, calculating the optimal angle for a canal based on the annual flood levels of the Nile, or meticulously charting the predictable journey of the star Sirius, whose heliacal rising signaled the imminent, life-giving inundation. This was the brilliant, holistic genius of the temple school. It operated on a foundational principle that seems almost foreign to our modern, often compartmentalized world, that to understand the gods, you had to understand the world they created, and to manage that world effectively was itself the highest form of worship. This integration produced a uniquely pragmatic form of spirituality. In Mesopotamia, the priest-astronomers of the ziggurats weren't just stargazing for mystical revelation. They were building a precise, mathematical science of prediction. They meticulously recorded the movements of planets, the phases of the moon, and the occurrence of eclipses on thousands of clay tablets, creating a vast database of celestial events. Their motivation was deeply religious. They believed the gods communicated their will through signs in the heavens. An eclipse might portend the death of a king. The appearance of a comet might foretell war. But to decode these divine messages, they had to develop incredibly accurate observational and computational techniques. They identified the repeating cycles of Venus, could predict lunar eclipses, and even developed early forms of trigonometry to map the sky. This temple-born astronomy was immediately applied to the most practical aspects of life. It created the calendar that organized the agricultural year. It set the dates for religious festivals, and it provided the astrological counsel that guided the decisions of kings. The same priest who offered a sacrifice to Shamash, the sun god, might later use his observations of that same sun to survey a field for taxation. There was no conflict between these roles. In his mind, they were two sides of the same sacred duty to maintain the balance of the world. In Egypt, this concept of the temple as a holistic knowledge repository reached its zenith. The House of Life was often a specific library and scriptorium attached to a major temple, like the one at Thebes or Heliopolis. It was part university, part research institute, and part publishing house. Here, scribes and priests did not only copy religious spells from the Book of the Dead. They also composed and studied medical papyri, like the famous Edwin Smith papyrus, which details surgical procedures for wounds with a cool, clinical detachment, diagnosing from an ailment I will treat to an ailment not to be treated. They developed advanced mathematics to calculate the volume of granaries and the slope of pyramids. They practiced architecture and engineering to design temples that were both spiritual powerhouses and feats of precise astronomical alignment, so that the sun would shine directly down the main axis on the statue of the god on the king's birthday. The Egyptian priest was a polymath, a healer, an architect, an accountant, and a theologian all at once. His education taught him that a broken bone, a rising river, and a prayer to Osiris were all interconnected threads in the same cosmic web. To know one was to better understand the others. This world, you created an education that was staggering in its breadth and depth, producing individuals who saw no divide between the rational and the mystical. Knowledge itself was a sacred trust, a divine gift given to humanity to help them participate in the ongoing creation and maintenance of the universe. This temple-based model of learning, which endured for thousands of years, bequeathed to the world a powerful legacy: the idea that the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms is ultimately a spiritual endeavor, a journey toward a greater understanding of the order and wonder inherent in all of creation. If the temple school was the beating heart of this new intellectual life, then the great library was its immortal soul, a place where the knowledge painstakingly produced by scribes and scholars could be gathered, protected, and woven together into something far greater than the sum of its parts. This was the next logical, breathtaking step in humanity's project of externalizing memory. No longer satisfied with just training scribes to create records, these ancient civilizations began to dream of gathering all records in one place, creating a collective brain for the entire society. The most spectacular early example was not in Egypt or Greece, but in the formidable Assyrian capital of Nineveh. In the 7th century BC, the king Ashurbanipal, a rare literate monarch, embarked on an ambition that still stuns the imagination. He didn't just want a royal archive, he wanted every important text in the world. He sent scribes and agents to every corner of his empire and beyond with orders to seek out, borrow, or simply confiscate every clay tablet of value. They returned with tens of thousands of them, covering the entire spectrum of known thought. Epic poetry like the story of Gilgamesh, complex astronomical observations, intricate medical diagnoses, detailed religious omen texts, sophisticated mathematical tables, and meticulous legal contracts. His library was systematically organized, with each tablet carefully labeled with a colophon stating its title and the original source it was taken from. This was not a haphazard collection. It was a deliberate, state-sponsored project to create a complete and total repository of Mesopotamian knowledge. It was, in essence, an attempt to build a backup drive for an entire civilization, ensuring that its memory would never be lost, even if its cities fell. But the most legendary of these institutions, the one that has burned itself into our collective memory as the ultimate symbol of this aspiration, was the Great Library of Alexandria. Founded in the 3rd century BC in the bustling, multicultural port city of Egypt, the library was part of a larger research complex called the Mauseon, or Temple of the Muses. Its stated goal was audacious in its simplicity: to collect every book in the world. Under the patronage of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, agents were stationed at the bustling port with orders to board every incoming ship. Any scroll found on board was confiscated and taken to the library, where teams of scribes would swiftly copy it. The original was often kept for the library's magnificent collections, while the copy was reluctantly given back to the owner. They were relentless, even reportedly negotiating with Athens to borrow their priceless official copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, offering a colossal security deposit. Athens sent them, and Ptolemy III famously kept the originals, sent back copies, and happily forfeited the deposit. The scale was unprecedented. Estimates of its holdings range from 40,000 to over 500,000 scrolls, a collection that represented the cumulative knowledge of the entire known world, from the philosophies of Greece to the histories of Babylon, the geometry of Egypt to the medicine of Persia. This was the first truly universal library, and it transformed Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The library's true power, however, lay not in mere accumulation, but in what that accumulation enabled: cross-cultural synthesis on a scale never before possible. For the first time, a scholar from Greece could stand in one room and compare a Babylonian astronomical tablet with an Egyptian papyrus on the same subject. He could cross-reference a medical text from India with a philosophical treatise from Sicily. This proximity of different traditions, languages, and schools of thought sparked an incredible intellectual ferment. It was here that the Greek geographer Eratosthenes, by reading accounts of the sun shining directly down a well in Syene on the summer solstice, was able to calculate the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. It was here that the anatomist Herophilus conducted groundbreaking dissections, advancing medical knowledge far beyond myth and superstition. The library provided the raw material, the collected memory of humankind, and the scholars provided the genius to connect the dots, to see patterns and relationships that were invisible when knowledge was scattered and isolated. It was the ancient world's greatest think tank, a place where the past was not just stored, but actively used to invent the future. And this is why the fate of the Library of Alexandria remains such a poignant and powerful tragedy. Its gradual destruction, whether by an accidental fire during Julius Caesar's campaigns, by Christian riots in the 4th century, or by later Islamic conquests, has become an enduring symbol of the profound fragility of knowledge itself. The burning of the library was not just the loss of a building or its contents. It was a lobotomy of human memory. It represented the terrifying possibility that centuries of accumulated discovery, stories, and wisdom could simply vanish in a moment of fire, war, or intolerance. The story of its loss serves as a permanent warning that externalizing our memory onto physical objects like scrolls, books, or even hard drives makes that memory simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable. It can be centralized, accessed, and amplified, but it can also be targeted, censored, and destroyed. The great libraries of antiquity were the ultimate expression of humanity's desire to remember everything, but their histories remind us that preservation is a constant, active struggle against the forces of oblivion. They were monuments to the belief that our collective memory is our greatest inheritance, and its safekeeping our most sacred responsibility. Yet the true genius of these Babylonian scholars lay not in their calculations alone, but in the abstract leaps they were willing to make. One particularly astonishing tablet, known as Plimpton 322, reveals something extraordinary. It contains a table of numbers that modern mathematicians recognize as Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 whole numbers that perfectly describe the sides of a right-angled triangle, like 3, 4, 5 or 5, 12, 13. This is significant for a breathtaking reason. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras, from whom we get the famous theorem, wouldn't be born for over 1,000 years. The Babylonians weren't just solving practical land problems. They were exploring the theoretical properties of numbers and shapes for their own sake. They had moved beyond mere calculation into the realm of pure mathematical discovery. recognizing patterns and relationships that governed spatial reality itself. This tablet is a silent but powerful testament to a profound shift in human cognition. It shows that within the walls of these early schools, the human mind was learning to play with numbers, to see them not just as tools for counting, but as keys to unlocking the hidden, abstract order of the universe. This new, quantitative way of thinking, forged in the classroom, didn't stay there. It spilled out into the streets, the markets, and the harbors, revolutionizing daily life by introducing something we now take completely for granted: standardization. Before this, a measure of grain in one town might be a completely different amount than in the next village a day's walk away. A cubit of length might be based on the forearm of the local chieftain. This lack of uniformity was a constant source of conflict and confusion, stifling trade and large-scale cooperation. The solution was born directly from the mathematical exercises of the scribble schools. Royal decrees, drafted by literate officials, began to establish official, standardized weights and measures. Archaeologists have found beautiful, polished stone cubes from Sumer and Egypt that served as the official mina weight. Merchants would carry smaller, personal sets of weights to ensure a fair transaction, all traceable back to that royal standard. This created a universal language of commerce. A merchant from could now travel to a distant city and be confident that when he agreed to sell 10 minas of wool, both he and his buyer were picturing the exact same quantity. Trust, which had once been a fragile, personal matter, was now embedded in a system backed by the authority of the king and the precision of mathematics. This revolution in measurement was the essential prerequisite for the breathtaking architectural achievements of the ancient world. You cannot build a pyramid, a ziggurat, or a massive temple complex with any degree of accuracy without a standardized and precise system of length, angle, and volume. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, has a square base whose sides are virtually identical in length, with an error margin of less than 2 centimeters. This astonishing precision, achieved over 4,500 years ago, would have been utterly impossible without a standardized royal cubit and a corps of scribes and overseers who were rigorously trained in the geometry needed to calculate slopes, align foundations to the cardinal directions, and manage the logistics of millions of stone blocks. The same mathematical principles taught in the schools how to calculate area, volume, and angles were directly applied to bending reality to human will, turning ambitious visions into enduring stone. Perhaps the most impactful application of this new quantitative mindset, however, was the creation of the calendar. For agricultural societies, timing was everything. Planting too early or too late could mean the difference between feast and famine. Early cultures tracked time by the moon, but lunar months don't neatly fit into a solar year, causing seasonal drift. Babylonian astronomer scribes, using meticulous records kept over generations, detected the patterns. They calculated the solar year with remarkable accuracy and developed complex intercalary systems, adding extra months at specific intervals to keep their lunar calendar in sync with the seasons. This was a monumental achievement in prediction. For the first time, a society could not just react to the world but could plan for it. They could predict the annual flooding of the rivers, schedule religious festivals for the same time every year, and plan agricultural and military campaigns with confidence. The calendar became a shared, externalized framework for collective memory and anticipation, a grid of time superimposed upon the chaos of nature. It allowed a king to command that a harvest begin on a specific date across his entire kingdom, confident that everyone understood exactly when that was. This ability to plan, predict, and operate on a grand scale across both space and time was a direct result of the mathematical discipline cultivated in the world's first schools. They had given humanity not just numbers but a new way of seeing, a lens of calculation and precision through which the entire world could be measured, managed, and remembered. But the celestial classroom extended far beyond mathematics, reaching literally for the stars. In the same scribble schools where students learned to calculate the area of a field, they were also trained to track the majestic, silent dance of the heavens. For ancient civilizations, astronomy was never a detached, abstract science. It was the ultimate practical discipline, a matter of survival and sovereignty woven into the very fabric of daily life. In Mesopotamia, the night sky was a vast, divine clock and calendar, and learning to read it was a core part of a scribe's education. Advanced students would spend long nights on the rooftops of ziggurats alongside priest astronomers, meticulously recording the movements of planets and stars on their clay tablets. They weren't just stargazing, they were data scientists compiling centuries of observations that revealed repeating cycles. They could predict the appearance of Venus, track the phases of the moon, and most impressively, forecast lunar eclipses. Their method was based on the Saros cycle, a repeating period of approximately 18 years after which eclipses repeat in a similar pattern. To recognize that pattern across generations of records required a profound commitment to preserving and building upon observational data, a project that could only be sustained by an organized school system. The ability to predict an eclipse was a source of immense power. In a world where such an event was seen as a terrifying omen, potentially signaling the downfall of a king or the wrath of a god, the astronomer priests who could stand before the ruler and announce, "The moon will be swallowed on this exact night," wielded incredible influence. It was the ultimate demonstration that through disciplined study, humans could decipher the will of the gods and anticipate the seemingly unpredictable forces of nature. This celestial knowledge was the engine of the agricultural world. The single most important event in the lives of Mesopotamian and Egyptian farmers was the annual flooding of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile rivers. These floods deposited rich silt onto the farmlands, creating the fertility that sustained their civilizations. But the floods did not arrive on a neat, predictable date on a modern calendar. Their timing was signaled by the stars. In Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius, the first day each year when the bright star became visible just before dawn after a period of absence, coincided almost perfectly with the Nile's inundation. This connection was so fundamental that the Egyptian calendar was built around it. In Mesopotamia, the position of certain stars at sunset marked the beginning and end of key months for planting and harvesting. The scribble schools were the institutions that standardized this knowledge, turning local folk observations into a precise, state-wide system. They produced the almanacs and calendars that were distributed to regional governors, telling entire populations exactly when to prepare the fields, when to sow the seeds, and when to expect the harvest. This transformed society from being reactive to proactive. Instead of waiting to see the river rise, they could prepare irrigation channels and store surplus grain in advance. This ability to plan based on celestial certainty reduced famine, stabilized the food supply, and allowed for population growth and urbanization. The calendar became the shared rhythm of civilization, a collective memory of time itself that dictated the pace of life for everyone from the peasant in the field to the king in his palace. This rhythm was sacred as much as it was practical. Religious festivals were intricately tied to these astronomical events. A new moon might mark the beginning of a month of observance. The solstice might be the day of a great festival for a sun god. The Babylonian New Year, Akitu, was a 12-day ceremony whose timing was determined by the spring equinox and the first sighting of the new moon. Its rituals were believed to literally rejuvenate the king, the gods, and the cosmic order itself for another year. The precise timing was everything. To hold the festival on the wrong day would be a catastrophic rupture in the relationship between humanity and the divine. The scribes and priests educated in the temple schools were the guardians of this sacred timing. Their ability to calculate the correct dates ensured that society remained in harmony with the cosmos. This embedded astronomical data deep into the very heart of cultural memory. The stories people told, the gods they worshipped, and the holidays they celebrated were all defined by the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. The sky was not a distant, empty space. It was the visible face of a living, ordered universe in which humanity played an active and participatory role. This worldview, cultivated and formalized in the earliest schools, gave people a profound sense of place and purpose. They were part of a grand, cosmic cycle, and their rituals and labors were essential to maintaining the balance of that cycle. This perspective was perhaps the most enduring legacy of this ancient astronomical training. It encouraged a cosmological view that saw the universe as fundamentally orderly and comprehensible. The Babylonians didn't see the movements of the stars as random or chaotic. They were predictable, governed by mathematical laws that could be discovered through patient observation and record-keeping. This was a revolutionary idea, that the cosmos operated according to consistent, knowable rules. This concept would travel west from the libraries of Mesopotamia and influence Greek natural philosophy profoundly. Thinkers like Thales of Miletus, who is famously said to have predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BCE, were likely drawing on knowledge of Babylonian astronomical records and methods. This idea of an orderly, law-bound cosmos became the foundational assumption for all of Western science. It is the reason a scientist today assumes that the laws of physics that work in a laboratory on Earth will also hold true in a distant galaxy. That faith in a rational, predictable universe is a direct inheritance from those ancient astronomer scribes on their ziggurats. They transformed the raw data of observation into a powerful philosophical principle that the universe is not a capricious realm of magic, but a system that can be understood. The schools that taught this discipline were not merely transmitting skills, they were shaping humanity's entire relationship with reality, turning awe into understanding and laying the groundwork for every scientific discovery that was to follow. While the scribes of Mesopotamia were calculating the paths of planets and the priests of Egypt were aligning their temples with the stars, another profound revolution in human understanding was taking shape. This one focused inward, on the intricate and mysterious landscape of the human body itself. For most of human history, illness and injury were understood through a lens of superstition and spirituality. A disease might be a punishment from a god, the work of a demon, or an imbalance of mystical humors. Healing was the domain of the shaman or the local wise woman, relying on passed-down herbal lore and ritual incantations. But in the temple schools of Egypt and later in the philosophical circles of Greece, a radical new idea began to emerge, that the body was not a playground for spirits, but a complex physical system that could be studied, understood, and treated through rational observation. This was the dawn of medicine as a systematic science, and it was in the earliest schools that this new approach was codified, written down, and taught to a new class of healer, the physician. Our most stunning window into this early medical revolution is a papyrus scroll dating back to around 1600 BCE, though it claims to be a copy of a text from 1,000 years earlier. This is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and it is arguably the world's first scientific medical treatise. Unlike other Egyptian medical texts that are filled with spells and charms, this document is breathtakingly modern in its method. It presents 48 cases of injuries and wounds, starting at the head and moving down the body, much like a modern anatomical textbook. For each case, it provides a tripartite structure: the title of the case, the examination, and the diagnosis. The physician is instructed to observe the patient's wound, to test for things like the ability to flex a limb or the stiffness of a neck, and to then deliver a verdict. The author uses two crucial phrases: an ailment which I will treat, and the far more sobering, an ailment not to be treated. This represents a monumental leap in thought. It is a recognition that medicine has limits, that not every case can be cured, and that a proper diagnosis based on evidence, not hope, is the foundation of ethical practice. The treatments it does prescribe are rational and practical: stitching wounds with a needle and thread, using honey as an antibacterial salve, applying splints to broken bones, and even using raw meat to stop bleeding on the first day. There is no appeal to the gods here, no attempt to drive out evil spirits. The text treats the human body as a mechanical object that can be repaired, a machine whose workings can be logically deduced through careful inspection. This papyrus was almost certainly a teaching tool, used in an Egyptian house of life to train new physicians in a standardized, evidence-based approach. It externalized the memory of successful treatments, turning individual healers' experience into a shared, cumulative body of knowledge that could be studied and improved upon by others. This empirical approach found its most famous expression centuries later in Greece, with the legendary figure of Hippocrates and the school of medicine that grew up around his name. What made the Hippocratic approach so revolutionary was its fundamental philosophy, encapsulated in the famous oath that placed patient care and ethical conduct above all else. The Hippocratic school, likely based on the island of Kos, functioned as a center for teaching and learning, where students would learn not just from texts, but from following a master physician on his rounds, observing patients firsthand. The core of their method was meticulous observation and record-keeping. The Hippocratic texts are filled with detailed case histories that read like clinical notes. They describe the color of a patient's urine, the quality of their fever, the sound of their cough, and the timing of their chills. They instructed physicians to note the season, the local weather, and the patient's diet and profession, understanding that illness did not exist in a vacuum but was influenced by the patient's entire environment. This practice of keeping detailed histories was the essential first step in moving from superstition to science. By recording what they saw, physicians could begin to detect patterns. They could see that certain symptoms often led to certain outcomes, that specific treatments seemed to yield better results for particular conditions. This created a feedback loop of knowledge. A physician in one city could read the case notes of a physician in another and learn from their findings. For the first time, medical knowledge became truly cumulative. Each generation of doctors could stand on the shoulders of the previous one, building a taller and taller tower of understanding instead of constantly rediscovering the same basic truths. This shift from an art to a science fundamentally expanded the scope of human memory. Where once the memory of healing resided in the hands and minds of individual practitioners, a fragile, personal treasury of recipes and experiences, it was now embedded in texts, in scrolls, in a growing library of anatomical and clinical knowledge. A student no longer had to rely solely on the fading memory of a single master. They could study the collected wisdom of hundreds of physicians across generations. This externalization allowed for a detail and complexity that oral tradition could never sustain. The Hippocratic text on the sacred disease, which is about epilepsy, is a powerful example. The author forcefully argues that this condition, commonly believed to be caused by divine possession, has a natural cause within the brain. He writes, "It is not, in my opinion, any more divine or more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause." And its cause is heredity. This was a direct assault on supernatural explanations, replacing them with a rational, materialist theory based on observation. It represented a colossal leap in thought, one that was only possible because this new class of educated physicians had the tools and the training to record, compare, and critically analyze their observations. They were using the technology of writing and the structure of the school to reinvent biological memory, creating a shared, external brain for the entire medical profession that would eventually pave the way for every medical advance that was to follow. Yet for all its power to heal the body, this new empirical mindset was about to encounter an even more profound challenge, one that would turn its gaze from the physical world to the very nature of thought itself. Far to the west, under the bright sun of Attica, a different kind of school was taking shape, one that would ask not, "How does the body work?" but "How should we live?" And what is true, this was the birth of philosophy, and it would spark a revolution in critical thinking that would forever change the purpose of education. Picture the lush, olive-shaded grounds just outside the walls of Athens, a sanctuary dedicated to the hero Academies. Here, around 387 BCE, the philosopher Plato established his academy, a school that was the polar opposite of the rigid, repetition-driven Aduber. There were no clay tablets for rote copying, no canes for punishment. Instead, small groups of students would walk along the shaded pathways, engaged in lively, often intense dialogue with their teachers. The air would have hummed with the energy of debate, of ideas being proposed, challenged, and refined. The curriculum was not about memorizing lists or mastering a practical skill for administrative work. It was about questioning everything. What is justice? What is the nature of reality? How can we know what is true? These were the problems that consumed them. The goal was not to absorb information but to develop the capacity for reason, to learn how to think clearly, logically, and ethically. This was a radical departure from every educational model that had come before. Where Mesopotamian and Egyptian schools were designed to produce loyal functionaries who would uphold the existing system, the academy aimed to produce enlightened individuals who could critically examine the system itself. The intellectual godfather of this transformative approach was a man who never wrote a single book, never founded a formal school, and was ultimately executed by the Athenian state for corrupting the youth Socrates. His lasting contribution, immortalized by his student Plato, was not a set of answers but a method of inquiry, a way of thinking that we now call the Socratic method. Socrates would approach someone who claimed to know what justice or courage was, and with genuine curiosity, he would begin asking deceptively simple questions. He would ask for definitions, probe for inconsistencies, and expose contradictions in their beliefs. He famously claimed that his only wisdom was in knowing that he knew nothing, and through his questioning, he aimed to show others that their own certainties were built on shaky foundations. This was not meant to be cynical or destructive. The purpose was to clear away the clutter of unexamined opinions and receive tradition to create space for genuine knowledge, for beliefs that could withstand rigorous scrutiny. It was a method that valued the process of thinking over the possession of facts. It taught that true understanding comes not from being told what is true, but from working one's way through the questions to arrive at a justified conclusion. This method made education an active, participatory, and deeply personal journey. A student in the academy wasn't a vessel to be filled with knowledge, they were a partner in its discovery. This shift from passive reception to active critical engagement had a profound effect on how humans engaged with complex concepts, and by extension, how they remembered them. In an oral tradition, memory was about preserving a fixed story. In the scribble schools, memory was about accurately reproducing a fixed text. but in the philosophical school, memory became dynamic. It was no longer about storing information verbatim, but about retaining the structure of an argument, the steps of a logical proof, the nuances of a definition. You didn't just remember what Plato said about the forms, you remembered the chain of reasoning that led him there, the objections raised by others, and the counterarguments offered in response. This required a much deeper and more flexible kind of cognitive engagement. It transformed memory from a simple recording device into an active tool for analysis and synthesis. This new model of learning made education a powerful engine for both personal and societal transformation. On a personal level, it held that the unexamined life was not worth living, that each individual had a responsibility to use their reason to seek truth and live virtuously. This was the ultimate form of empowerment, suggesting that wisdom was not the exclusive property of priests or elites, but was accessible to anyone who was willing to think critically. On a societal level, this kind of education was seen as essential for democracy. Athenian citizens were expected to participate directly in their assembly, serve on juries, and hold public office. To do this well, they needed to be able to analyze speeches, spot faulty logic, evaluate evidence, and make reasoned judgments about complex matters of law and policy. The philosophical schools, in teaching critical thinking, were training citizens for the demands of self-government. They were creating a public that could remember not just what a law said, but why it was enacted, what principles it was based on, and what its potential consequences might be. This was a richer, more conceptual form of cultural memory, one that could adapt and evolve through reasoned debate rather than simply being preserved in amber. Plato's academy and schools like it didn't just add a new subject called philosophy to the curriculum. They reinvented the very soul of education, setting a new and enduring ideal that the highest purpose of learning is not to replicate the past, but to understand it, to question it, and to build a more thoughtful future. But this new power to question and reason placed a tremendous demand on the very tool they were using to do it, language itself. As philosophical debates grew more complex and written texts multiplied, a pressing problem emerged. How could you be sure that everyone was understanding the same words in the same way? How could you protect a sacred hymn or a legal decree from being corrupted over centuries of copying? The solution to this crisis of meaning would not be found in a new law or a new god, but in a breathtaking intellectual achievement, the invention of grammar. This was the moment humanity turned its analytical gaze inward upon the structure of its own speech, and in doing so, created a science that would ensure its most precious ideas could travel across time and space without distortion. Two ancient civilizations, completely independent of one another, arrived at this same revolutionary insight almost simultaneously. In the lush forest schools of ancient India and the bustling scholarly centers of Hellenistic Greece, linguists performed an act of profound introspection. They took something as fluid and natural as spoken language and froze it in place, dissecting its patterns, classifying its components, and writing down the rules that governed its inner workings. They realized that to preserve knowledge perfectly, you first had to understand the machine that carried it. In India, this project was driven by a deep, sacred imperative. The Vedas, the ancient hymns and rituals that formed the foundation of Hindu religious life, were considered eternal and divinely revealed. Their potency was believed to lie not just in their meaning, but in their precise sonic form. Every syllable, every accent, every musical intonation had to be reproduced with perfect accuracy to maintain their spiritual power. For over a millennium, this was achieved through an incredible oral tradition, using elaborate mnemonic techniques to pass the texts down unchanged. But by the 5th century BCE, The fear that the language was changing and the pronunciations were being lost prompted a brilliant scholar named Panini to undertake a monumental task. He would create a complete, rule-based description of the Sanskrit language. The result was the Ashtadhyayi, the 8 chapters, a linguistic masterpiece that stands as one of the most intellectual feats of the ancient world. Panini's grammar is staggering in its precision and economy. He didn't write a long, descriptive textbook. He composed a dense, algorithmic code of nearly 4,000 rules that can generate every correct word and sentence in classical Sanskrit. He identified the language's root morphemes, the tiny units of meaning, and then created a system of prefixes, suffixes, and sound changes that could be applied to them. He even accounted for exceptions, creating a meta-rule that a later, more specific rule would override an earlier, more general one. This was a system of such logical rigor and completeness that it has been compared to a computer programming language. A student who mastered Panini's system could theoretically generate any grammatically correct Sanskrit sentence or analyze any sentence to confirm its validity. This ensured that the Vedas and all future literature could be composed, recited, and transmitted with previously unimaginable accuracy. The language was no longer a living, changing river. Panini had built a perfect crystalline canal system for it to flow through forever. On the other side of the world, in the cosmopolitan city of Alexandria, Greek scholars were grappling with a similar but different challenge. As Greek culture spread across the Mediterranean after the conquests of Alexander the Great, the language began to change and fragment into dialects. The great works of Homer, Plato, and the Athenian playwrights were becoming harder for non-Athenians to understand. There was a growing need to standardize the language for education, administration, and, crucially, for the library's mission of preserving and cataloging texts. The man who provided the framework was a scholar named Dionysius Thrax. Around 100 BCE, he wrote the Techn Grammatique, the Art of Grammar, a concise but groundbreaking work that became the standard textbook for the Greek-speaking world for over 1,000 years. Where Panini's work was a complex, self-contained system of logic, Dionysius's was a practical, pedagogical tool of classification. He was the first to systematically define and label the parts of speech that we still use today: noun, verb, participle, article, pronoun, preposition, adverb, and conjunction. He provided clear definitions for each. A verb, for instance, was defined as a word without case inflection, but inflected for tense, person, and number, signifying an activity or process. This act of categorization was revolutionary. It gave students and scholars a shared vocabulary and a clear set of criteria for analyzing any sentence. A copyist in the library could now use this grammar to check the syntax of a manuscript he was transcribing. A teacher in a distant province could use it to ensure his students were learning the correct form of Attic Greek. It turned the chaotic flow of speech into an organized structure that could be taught, examined, and corrected. This formal, scientific study of language had an impact that rippled far beyond the classroom or the scriptorium. By turning speech into an object of study, grammar enhanced clarity in every field that relied on the written word. In law, a precisely drafted contract or a carefully worded statute left far less room for malicious misinterpretation or honest confusion. The definitions and logical structures provided by grammar became the tools for legal argumentation. In literature, writers could now play with the rules self-consciously, using complex syntax and rhetorical devices to achieve new levels of artistic expression and persuasive power. Oratory, so central to Greek and Roman political life, became a refined art built upon a solid understanding of grammatical structure. Most importantly, grammar provided a new, more refined method for encoding and recalling knowledge. A complex philosophical argument or a detailed scientific observation could now be expressed with a precision that made it far more likely to be understood exactly as the author intended, even by readers centuries later and continents away. The sentence itself became a more reliable vessel for thought. This was the final, crucial step in the project of externalizing memory. It wasn't enough to just write ideas down. You had to write them down in a way that was structurally sound and unambiguous. Grammar was the quality control mechanism for the human mind's most important product, language. It ensured that the precious content of our collective memory, once placed into the external storage of texts, would not degrade over time but would remain sharp, clear, and ready for the next generation to unlock and build upon. Yet for all the power of grammar to clarify the written word, it was a different, more ancient art form that truly mastered the art of binding knowledge to the human mind, an art that engaged not just the intellect but the entire body and soul. Long before the first grammatical rule was ever written down, the world's earliest teachers had discovered a profound secret, that melody and rhythm were the most powerful mnemonic technologies ever invented. In an age without paper or pen, how could you preserve a complex text for 1,000 years? The answer was not to write it down, but to sing it. This was the brilliant, enduring strategy of the Vedic schools of ancient India, where an entire civilization's sacred knowledge was entrusted not to clay or papyrus, but to the human voice, trained to perfection through the mesmerizing power of music. Imagine a group of young Brahmin students sitting cross-legged before their teacher in a forest hermitage, not reading from a book, but listening with an intensity we can scarcely comprehend today. Their task was to learn the Vedas, the vast body of hymns, rituals, and philosophical teachings that formed the bedrock of their culture, but they were forbidden to write them down. The knowledge was considered too sacred, too potent to be captured in inert symbols. It had to live and breathe in the very breath and bones of the initiated. So they learned through an intricate, multi-layered system of recitation that turned language into a precise sonic architecture. They didn't just memorize the words, they memorized the exact pitch, the rhythm, the cadence, and even the precise bodily gestures that accompanied the chant. The text was broken down into complex patterns. Some words were sung forward, then backward, then in combinations. A method designed to make accidental alteration virtually impossible. The student wasn't just a recorder, he was a living, breathing, singing library. The goal was absolute fidelity. The belief was that the spiritual power of the hymn was inextricably linked to its perfect sonic form. A single mispronunciation, a slight error in pitch, wasn't just a mistake. It was a cosmic rupture, a failure of duty to the gods themselves. This immense pressure created a culture of unimaginably precise oral transmission. Through this musical method, the Vedas were passed down orally for over 3,000 years before ever being committed to writing, preserved with an accuracy that modern scholars find astonishing when they compare the oldest written versions to the living oral tradition. This was memory not as a cold storage system, but as a sacred, embodied performance, a continuous act of cultural renewal where the learner became a living link in an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of time. This fusion of music and memory was not unique to India. Across the ancient world, educators understood that rhythm and melody were keys to unlocking the mind's retention. In Greece, the legendary poet Homer composed his epic tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey in a strict poetic meter called dactylic hexameter. This wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a practical technology for bards who needed to hold thousands of lines in their head. The steady, predictable rhythm, a pattern of long and short syllables like a musical score, provided a mental scaffold. It told the bard what came next, guiding his memory through the vast narrative landscape. Later, Greek educators formalized this insight. They discovered that different musical modes, the scales of their time, could evoke different emotional states. A stirring Dorian mode might be used to recount heroic tales of battle, making the events feel more immediate and thrilling, while a softer Lydian mode might be employed for a tragic story, deepening the sense of pathos and loss. By setting historical events or poetic lessons to music, they were doing far more than making them catchy. They were engaging the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. A fact learned to a simple melody becomes a fact felt. The emotional charge of the music creates a stronger, more durable neural pathway, making the information far more resistant to forgetting. A student wouldn't just recall the date of a battle. They would remember the mournful melody that accompanied the story of its fallen heroes, and the date would be embedded within that rich sensory experience. This was learning as a full-body experience, engaging the ear, the voice, and the heart all at once. This ancient, multisensory approach reveals a deep wisdom about the nature of memory that much of modern education has sadly forgotten. We often treat memory as a simple, mechanical process of input and storage, cramming facts into the brain as if it were an empty warehouse, but the ancient teachers knew better. They understood that memory is fundamentally about connection. A dry list of names and dates is easily forgotten because it has nothing to connect to. It floats in the mind without anchors. But a fact woven into a story, set to a melody, and charged with emotion becomes part of a rich tapestry. It connects to the auditory cortex through the music, to the motor cortex if accompanied by gesture or dance, and to the amygdala through the feelings it evokes. These multiple connection points create a robust network, ensuring that if one path of recall fails, another can take its place. This is why you can still remember the lyrics to songs from your childhood decades later, while struggling to recall what you read in a textbook last month. The song is connected to a time, a place, a feeling, a melody, a whole constellation of associations. The ancient schools intentionally designed learning to create these constellations. They realized that to make knowledge truly memorable, it had to be made meaningful, it had to resonate, it had to matter. By embedding information in the powerful, universal language of music, they were not just preserving data, they were ensuring that the wisdom of the past remained a living, vibrant, and emotionally resonant force in the present. This lesson that the most enduring learning engages more than just the intellect is a timeless gift from the first schools, reminding us that true knowledge is not just stored but sung, felt, and remembered with the whole self. This focus on character was not an afterthought in the ancient classroom. It was the very bedrock upon which all other learning was built. Long before a scribe in training could be trusted to draft a legal contract or record a king's decree, he had to first prove himself trustworthy, respectful, and acutely aware of his place within a larger social fabric. The ultimate goal of these early institutions was not merely to create skilled professionals, but to mold good citizens, individuals who would wield their knowledge with wisdom and responsibility, ensuring the stability and harmony of the entire community. This was achieved through a deliberate and pervasive curriculum in ethics, using some of the world's oldest surviving wisdom literature as their guides. In Egypt, students might have studied the Instructions of Ptahhotep, a text composed around 2400 BCE, making it one of the earliest philosophical works ever discovered. Ptahhotep, a vizier to the pharaoh, offers advice to his son that reads with a startlingly modern resonance. He doesn't just list rules, he paints scenarios. He counsels on how to debate fairly with a superior, urging respect even when one is right. He advises on listening patiently, arguing that quiet attentiveness is more valuable than the speech of an ignorant man. He speaks against greed, warning that coveting property can lead to a man losing all that is truly his. This was not abstract philosophy. It was a practical manual for navigating the complex social hierarchy of the Egyptian court, teaching young officials that intelligence without humility and integrity was not just useless, it was dangerous. A similar yet distinct approach flourished on the other side of the world in the schools of ancient China, shaped by the teachings of Confucius. His Analects were less a formal textbook and more a collection of conversations and anecdotes, capturing a philosophy where moral virtue was the highest form of knowledge. For Confucius, learning was inseparable from ethical cultivation. The ideal educated person, the junzi or gentleman, was not defined by wealth or birth but by his character, his benevolence, his righteousness, his loyalty, and his deep sense of reciprocity. Students memorized and debated these texts, internalizing principles like filial piety, the respect for one's parents and ancestors, which was seen as the foundational virtue from which all other social responsibilities grew. This was moral education as a form of social glue. By instilling a universal code of conduct that emphasized respect for elders, honesty in dealings, and duty to the community, these schools were actively building a cohesive, orderly society. An educated individual was expected to be a moral exemplar, his behavior serving as a model that would inspire others and reinforce the collective values that held the civilization together. This focus on embedding ethics into the very core of learning reveals a profound understanding of power. The ancients recognized that knowledge, particularly the specialized knowledge of reading, writing, and calculation, was a formidable tool. In the wrong hands, those of a greedy, arrogant, or dishonest individual, it could be used to exploit, oppress, and create chaos. A scribe could falsify a land deed. A priest could manipulate a religious text for personal gain. An official could embezzle taxes. The strict moral instruction served as a crucial safeguard, an internal compass designed to ensure that this powerful new technology of writing would be used to maintain order and justice, not to undermine it. The classroom became a training ground for conscience, where the cane punished not only grammatical errors but also lapses in judgment and character. This created a powerful link between intellect and virtue, suggesting that true wisdom was impossible without a strong moral foundation. The legacy of this ancient integration is immense. It established the idea, which still resonates deeply today, that the ultimate purpose of education is more than career preparation or the transfer of information. It is about character formation. It is about producing individuals who are not only smart but also good, who understand that their knowledge comes with a responsibility to their community and to the truth itself. This ancient insight, that learning and ethics must walk hand in hand, remains one of the most enduring and vital gifts from the world's first schools. For centuries, the powerful technology of literacy remained a closely guarded secret, a key that unlocked the doors of power and privilege for a tiny elite. But walls, no matter how high, have a way of developing cracks, and the human desire for understanding is a relentless force. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the light of learning began to seep out from the sealed scriptoria of the palaces and temples, finding new homes in the most unexpected of places. One of the most profound and early challenges to this monopoly on knowledge emerged not in a royal court, but in the humble, decentralized houses of worship within the Jewish tradition. The synagogue became one of the world's first institutions to champion the idea of universal male literacy. Driven by a powerful religious imperative, the need for every Jewish male to be able to read and directly engage with the Torah, communities established schools, or Bet Sefer, to teach boys to read Hebrew. This was a radical departure from the model where literacy was a professional skill for scribes. Here, it was a spiritual duty for every individual, a direct line to divine law that did not require a priestly caste to interpret. It was a democratization of the sacred, ensuring that the core text of their culture and identity could be accessed, debated, and internalized by the entire community, not just its rulers. A parallel, though philosophically distinct, revolution was unfolding in the bustling agora of Athens. Here, the driving force was not religious law, but political ideology. The Athenian democracy, for all its limitations, was predicated on the active participation of its citizen body in the assembly, on juries, and in public office. To be an effective citizen, to follow complex legal arguments, to dissect the persuasive rhetoric of politicians, and to cast an informed vote required a certain level of education. While formal schools were still private and largely for those who could afford them, the city-state fostered an environment where learning was valued as a public good. This created a society with a significantly broader base of literate and critically thinking individuals than any of its contemporaries. The great philosophers of the age recognized this fundamental link between education and a functional state. Aristotle, in his Politics, argued forcefully that the stability and prosperity of the city depended on the virtue of its citizens, and that virtue had to be cultivated through deliberate instruction. He wrote that the legislator should make the education of the young his object above all, for the neglect of education does harm to the constitution. This was a seismic shift in thinking. Education was no longer just a personal advantage or a tool for state administration. It was the very foundation of self-governance, the essential ingredient that prevented democracy from descending into mob rule or demagoguery. The societal impacts of this gradual spread of literacy were nothing short of transformative. As more people gained the ability to read and write, participation in governance and commerce exploded. In the marketplace, literacy reduced the potential for fraud and misunderstanding. A merchant could now read a contract for himself, rather than relying on the potentially biased interpretation of a scribe on someone else's payroll. This built trust across longer distances and between strangers, facilitating a more complex and far-reaching economy. In the political sphere, the ability to read proposed laws posted in the agora meant citizens could come to the assembly prepared to debate, rather than simply reacting to a spoken summary. They could study the histories of Herodotus or the arguments of Plato, arming themselves with a broader perspective on human nature and statecraft. This created a more informed and consequently more robust public discourse. The shared ability to access the same text created a new kind of collective mind, a polis that could remember its past decisions, analyze its present challenges, and plan for its future with a common framework of understanding. This democratization of reading and writing accomplished something even more profound on a civilizational scale. It transformed the very nature of human memory. For millennia, collective memory had been a privileged asset, curated and controlled by a small elite who decided what was worth preserving and how it would be interpreted. It was a centralized, top-down system. The spread of literacy decentralized it. Memory became a shared resource, a distributed network. Now, a humble farmer could keep a written record of his crop rotations to improve his yield next year. A local poet could write down her verses, preserving them for her town long after her voice was silent. A common soldier could carve his name on a monument, ensuring his participation in a great event would not be forgotten. This explosion of perspectives meant that history was no longer written solely by the victors in the king's court. It could now be annotated, critiqued, and supplemented by a much wider range of voices. This multiplicative effect supercharged the engine of human progress. Innovation was no longer as vulnerable to the loss of a single great mind or the destruction of one royal library. Ideas could be recorded, shared, and improved upon by countless individuals across vast distances and generations. A mathematical insight from a scholar in Alexandria could be read and refined by a thinker in India. A medical observation from a physician in Egypt could be debated and tested by a healer in Greece. Literacy had built a new, resilient, and collaborative brain for humanity, one that was far greater than the sum of its parts. Yet for all the revolutionary expansion of literacy and learning we've witnessed, this new intellectual world had a profound and deeply consequential boundary, one that ran directly through the lives of half the population. While young boys in Sumer hunched over their clay tablets and Athenian citizens debated philosophy in the agora, the vast majority of women were systematically excluded from these halls of knowledge. Their education, if it existed at all, was almost entirely domestic, focused on skills like weaving, managing household servants, and raising children. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was a deliberate feature of these ancient societies which largely viewed women as legal minors, first under the authority of their fathers and then their husbands. Their primary value was seen in their roles as wives and mothers, not as scholars or scribes. To teach a woman to read and write was, in the eyes of many, to risk upsetting the entire social order, giving her a tool for independence and critical thought that challenged her prescribed place. The result was that for centuries, the vast project of externalizing human memory, of writing the laws, recording the histories, and composing the literature, was conducted almost exclusively by men. The collective brain of civilization was, for the longest time, missing half of its potential minds. There were, of course, brilliant and notable exceptions that proved the rule, women who managed to breach these formidable barriers through privilege, talent, or sheer force of will. On the Greek island of Lesbos in the 6th century BC, the poet Sappho ran what was essentially a finishing school for young women from wealthy families. But it was far more than that. It was a celebrated literary salon, a place where music, poetry, and intellectual discourse flourished under her guidance. Sappho herself became so renowned that Plato later called her the 10th Muse, and her lyric poetry, though only fragments survive today, was considered among the finest ever written in the ancient world. Her work was studied and admired for centuries, a powerful testament to what women could achieve when given access to education. In Egypt, the path to knowledge was often through religion. Women could become priestesses, particularly in the cults of goddesses like Isis or Hathor. This sacred office came with significant social standing and required a high degree of literacy to perform complex rituals, interpret religious texts, and manage the temple's often vast economic holdings. These women were not mere ceremonial figures. They were powerful administrators and keepers of divine knowledge. We also have evidence from Mesopotamia of a very small number of female scribes, often from royal families or the very highest echelons of society, where extraordinary privilege could sometimes override customary gender restrictions. These rare examples shine like isolated beacons, demonstrating that the capacity for intellectual genius was always there. They were not the lacking element, the opportunity was. The long-term consequences of this systemic exclusion are almost incalculable. First and most directly, it represented a catastrophic loss of individual potential. Think of the countless brilliant minds over the centuries, the inventors, the philosophers, the scientists, the poets whose talents were never nurtured, whose ideas were never recorded, and whose contributions were forever lost to the world simply because they were born female. This intellectual drain undoubtedly delayed the pace of human progress in every field imaginable. How many medical cures, technological innovations, or profound works of art died with the women who conceived them but lacked the means to develop or communicate them? The second consequence is perhaps even more insidious. It created a historical record that is profoundly skewed and incomplete. For thousands of years, history was written by men about men and for men. The experiences, perspectives, and concerns of women, which constitute half of the human experience, are largely absent from the official annals. We know a great deal about the battles kings fought and the laws they passed, but we know remarkably little about the daily lives, thoughts, and social networks of women from these same periods. Their stories were considered unimportant, not worthy of the scribe's stylus. This has left us with a lopsided understanding of our own past, one that has only recently begun to be corrected by historians painstakingly piecing together clues from archaeology, art, and the rare surviving fragments of women's own writing. This ancient legacy of educational exclusion casts a long shadow, one that modern societies are still struggling to escape. It established deep-seated cultural assumptions about gender and intelligence that took millennia to challenge. It helps explain why the fight for girls' education remains a critical issue in many parts of the world today, and why women are still underrepresented in certain fields of science and technology. The story of the world's first schools is thus a story of both incredible achievement and profound limitation. They built the foundation for all modern learning, but they also built walls. They showed humanity how to remember, but they also chose what and who to forget. This reminds us that education is never a neutral tool. It is always a reflection of the values and power structures of the society that creates it. The struggle to make learning truly inclusive, to ensure that every voice has the chance to be heard and remembered, is not a new chapter in human history. It is the vital, ongoing process of finishing an old one that was left half-written for far too long. But the impact of these newly literate officials extended far beyond mere record-keeping. It fundamentally reshaped the very concept of justice and power. Imagine a world where the law lived only in the memory of the elders or the arbitrary will of a local chieftain. A ruling in one village could be completely different from a ruling in the next, and a king's decree might be forgotten or twisted beyond recognition by the time it reached a distant province. This was the reality before the scribble schools began producing a class of experts who could do something revolutionary: write the law down. The earliest known example of this is the Code of Ur-Nammu, written in Sumerian around 2100 BCE, over 3 centuries before the more famous Code of Hammurabi. This was not a simple list of rules. It was a sophisticated legal document that established a standard of justice across the entire kingdom of Ur. It replaced the old principle of blood feud and arbitrary retaliation with a system of monetary compensation for specific injuries. It stated, for example, that if a man cut off another man's foot, he must pay 10 silver shekels in compensation. This introduced a profound new idea that justice could be measured, standardized, and made proportional to the offense. It was a move away from vengeance and toward a concept of fairness that applied to everyone, at least in theory. This transformation was made possible entirely by the legal scribes trained in the Aduber. These weren't just clerks, they were the world's first lawyers and legal scholars. They were the ones who drafted the original codes, who could read them aloud in the city square for all to hear, and who were tasked with interpreting them when a complex dispute arose. They turned the abstract will of the king into a precise, actionable text. This created a permanent public reference point. For the first time, a citizen could, in a dispute, appeal to a written statute rather than just the mood or bias of a local official. This dramatically reduced the potential for capricious and corrupt judgments. A judge could no longer simply invent a punishment on the spot. He was expected to consult the written code and apply its standards. This made justice far more predictable, which is the absolute bedrock of a stable society. People need to know the consequences of their actions to make rational choices. They need to trust that the rules won't change randomly tomorrow. The written law, managed by a trained bureaucratic class, created that trust. It embedded the concept of the rule of law, the idea that everyone, from the poorest farmer to the king himself, is subject to the same publicly known legal principles, directly into the cultural memory of civilization. It was no longer just a tradition, it was a text, and that text could be copied, stored, and referred to for centuries. This model of legal education and codification reached its zenith in the Roman Empire. The Romans, master administrators, took the concept to a new level of sophistication. They established formal schools of jurisprudence where students didn't just learn to copy laws, but to debate their finer points, interpret their meanings, and apply them to new and complex situations. Great jurists like Gaius and Ulpian produced massive, multi-volume commentaries that analyzed the law from every conceivable angle. Roman law became a vast, intricate system that could handle everything from international trade contracts and property rights to inheritance and family disputes. The precision of this legal language, drafted by highly educated officials, was what allowed the Roman Empire to govern a vast, multicultural domain for centuries. A contract written by a Roman scribe in Britain would be enforceable by a Roman judge in Egypt because the legal terms and principles were standardized across the entire empire. This created an unprecedented level of economic and social integration. The Roman legal tradition, preserved and taught in its schools, didn't die with the empire. It became the foundation for the civil law systems that govern most of Europe and Latin America today, and its principles of justice, equity, and legal reasoning deeply influenced the common law tradition as well. The work of those ancient legal scribes, trained in classrooms over 2,000 years ago, still echoes in courtrooms around the world, proving that the principles institutionalized by education can become some of the most enduring artifacts of human civilization. While philosophers debated the nature of justice and astronomers charted the heavens, another, more grounded revolution was taking place in the classroom, one that would lay the foundation for the entire material world of commerce and wealth. The bustling economies of ancient Mesopotamia, with their vast networks of trade and complex systems of taxation, generated a problem that oral tradition was utterly incapable of solving: an overwhelming flood of numerical data. How could a temple administrator keep track of the thousands of sheep delivered as tribute? How could a merchant in prove he was owed a specific amount of silver by a business partner in a distant city? The solution was born in the same scribble schools that produced the legal scholars, but here the focus was not on lofty ideals of justice, but on the meticulous, unglamorous, and utterly essential science of accounting. This was where education became the engine of the economy. In the Aduber, students spent as much time mastering numbers as they did words. Their clay tablets were not just for poetry, they were the world's first spreadsheets, crammed with calculations for interest rates, inventories of goods, and balanced ledgers. A typical exercise might involve calculating the compound interest on a loan of barley over several years, or determining the precise area of an irregularly shaped field to assess its tax value. This was not theoretical math, it was math with immediate, real-world consequences. A single miscalculation could mean a merchant losing his entire investment or a temple missing its revenue targets. The pressure for accuracy was immense, and the curriculum was designed to forge that precision into a reflexive skill. students learned standardized systems of weights and measures, and they practiced converting between them, turning talents into minas and shekels with the same ease a modern student might convert miles to kilometers. This rigorous training produced a new kind of professional, the financial scribe, a human calculator who could bring order to the chaotic torrent of economic life. Armed with his stylus and tablet, he could freeze a dynamic transaction in time, creating a permanent, unambiguous record that all parties could trust. This simple act of writing down a debt transformed it from a fragile personal promise into a concrete, enforceable fact. It was the invention of financial memory, and it changed everything. This newfound ability to keep perfect records did more than just prevent arguments. It unleashed a wave of economic innovation that would have been impossible otherwise. The most significant of these was the facilitation of long-distance trade. Imagine a merchant preparing a caravan for a months-long journey to a far-off land to trade copper for precious stones. In a purely oral culture, such an venture would be fraught with unimaginable risk. He would have to rely on the memory of his agents to recall complex agreements, and he would have no way to verify accounts of sales or losses upon their return. The potential for misunderstanding, forgetfulness, or outright fraud was staggering, but with a trained scribe on staff, everything changed. Before the caravan departed, the scribe would itemize every single item loaded onto the donkeys, creating multiple copies of the inventory on clay tablets. These tablets would be sealed in clay envelopes and broken open only at the destination to verify that nothing had been tampered with en route. At the market, the scribe would record every sale and purchase, noting the prices, the quantities, and the names of the trading partners. He could calculate exchange rates between different currencies and keep a running tally of profits and expenses. When the merchant returned home, he carried with him not just exotic goods, but a complete and verifiable financial record of the entire expedition. This documentary evidence allowed for capital to flow over vast distances. An investor back in Ur could now finance a trading mission to Anatolia with confidence, knowing that a written contract and a detailed accounting would protect his investment. This system of verification built trust between strangers who would never meet, creating the first networks of international commerce. The world began to shrink, not because travel was faster, but because trust could now be documented and stored on a shelf. The impact of this literate bureaucracy extended deep into the heart of domestic governance as well, giving rise to the first sophisticated systems of economic planning and taxation. The palace and the temple were not just religious and political centers. They were the largest economic enterprises in the land, employing thousands of people and managing enormous stockpiles of grain, oil, wool, and other commodities. Managing this economy required a bird's-eye view that was simply impossible without written records. Scribes were deployed to every corner of the kingdom. They conducted censuses, recording the number of people in each city and the livestock they owned. They assessed the yield of harvests to calculate the grain tax owed to the state. They managed the complex payroll for thousands of workers, distributing rations of beer, bread, and wool based on meticulous records of time worked and status. These thousands of administrative tablets, often seen as dry and bureaucratic, are in fact the beating heart of the ancient state. They allowed central planners to see surplus and shortage across the entire kingdom. They could anticipate famine by comparing harvest records from previous lean years and authorize the distribution of grain from state storehouses to prevent starvation. They could budget for massive public works projects like digging a new irrigation canal or building a city wall by calculating the exact number of workers needed and the vast quantities of food required to sustain them. This was the birth of macroeconomics, the ability to see an economy not as a series of disconnected individual transactions, but as an interconnected system that could be measured, analyzed, and deliberately managed for the common good. The classroom, by producing the scribes who made this possible, became the silent partner in every great architectural achievement and every successful harvest. It demonstrated that education's most profound value often lies not in the contemplation of abstract truths, but in the mastery of practical systems that allow human societies to feed, clothe, and protect themselves on an unprecedented scale. But the work of these early schools extended far beyond the ledgers of merchants and the decrees of kings. They were also the silent, steady hands that sculpted the very soul of a civilization, its mythology. Before the rise of writing, the great stories of gods and heroes existed as countless, shimmering variations, told and retold around campfires from one generation to the next, changing subtly with each teller's voice and each audience's expectation. These were living, breathing narratives, but they were also fragile, shifting with the winds of memory and migration. The advent of the scribble school changed this dynamic forever. It offered a powerful new possibility that a story could be fixed, standardized, and preserved in a single, authoritative version. The classroom became the crucible where local tales were forged into national epics, where the fluid folklore of a region was crystallized into the shared cultural heritage of an entire people. This was perhaps one of their most profound and overlooked functions, not just to train accountants and officials, but to become the guardians of a collective identity, the librarians of the human spirit. We can see this process with stunning clarity in the world's first great epic, the story of Gilgamesh. For centuries, tales of the legendary king of Uruk had circulated throughout Mesopotamia in various Sumerian poems. He was a figure of local legend, a powerful but flawed hero whose adventures and griefs were sung in different ways in different city-states. Then, in the old Babylonian period, a brilliant scribe, or perhaps a school of scribes, undertook a monumental creative act. They wove these disparate stories together into a single, coherent, and breathtakingly profound narrative cycle. They gave it a new structure, a deeper psychological depth, and a unifying theme: Gilgamesh's desperate, futile quest for immortality following the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, and his ultimate reconciliation with his own mortal nature. This new, composite version didn't just tell a story, it asked the biggest questions about life, death, and what it means to be human. Once this master version was created, the scribble schools took over. Generation after generation of students practiced their cuneiform by meticulously copying out passages from the epic. They learned the standard version, the official text. A tablet found in one city would now match almost word for word a tablet found hundreds of miles away. Through this relentless process of copying in the classroom, the Epic of Gilgamesh was transformed from a collection of popular tales into a formal literary masterpiece, a canonical text that defined Mesopotamian culture for 1,000 years. It was the schoolhouse, with its emphasis on accurate replication, that ensured this foundational work of world literature would survive its own civilization, waiting in the ruins for modern archaeologists to discover and for all of humanity to reclaim. This act of preservation was about much more than saving a good story. These standardized myths became the primary textbooks for teaching a society's values, its history, and its place in the world. The Iliad and the Odyssey, copied and recited by Greek students for centuries, did far more than recount a war and a long journey home. They were a masterclass in Greek ethics. The Iliad's Achilles embodied the tragic tension between personal glory and communal responsibility. Hector's doomed defense of Troy became the ultimate model of patriotism and duty to one's city. The Odyssey's clever, enduring Odysseus celebrated intelligence and resilience over brute strength. These narratives provided a shared framework for what it meant to be a hero, a citizen, a good person. They were not just entertainment, they were the core of a moral and civic education, providing archetypes and dilemmas that every young Greek was expected to know and internalize. Furthermore, these stories served as a form of historical memory long before formal history was invented. While the Trojan War itself may be more legend than fact, the epics preserved memories of a distant Mycenaean past, details of armor, ship designs, and social structures that archaeologists have found to be remarkably accurate. For the Greeks, the Iliad was their history. It told them who they were, where they came from, and what their ancestors had achieved. It created a powerful, shared past that united the often feuding Greek city-states into a single cultural sphere, giving them a common ancestry in the heroes who fought before the walls of Troy. This curation of mythology by educated elites thus served the vital function of reinforcing social bonds and providing a crucial sense of continuity amidst the constant change and uncertainty of the ancient world. In a time of invasion, famine, or political upheaval, a community could turn to these stable, enduring stories. They were an anchor in a turbulent sea. The repetitive, cyclical nature of many myth stories of dying and rising gods, of great floods followed by renewal, mirrored the agricultural and seasonal cycles of their lives, offering comfort and a sense of cosmic order. To hear the same story your grandfather heard, and his grandfather before him, created an unbroken thread connecting the present to the distant past. It was a powerful antidote to the fear of oblivion, a declaration that the community's identity and values would endure. This function of education, to act as the steward of cultural memory, remains one of its most vital roles today. Our classrooms are still where we introduce each new generation to the foundational stories, the great literature, the pivotal historical events, and the artistic achievements that define our collective identity. We teach Shakespeare not just for the beauty of the language, but because his plays explore timeless aspects of the human condition that bind us across centuries. We teach the Constitution not just as a historical document, but as the living story of a nation's ideals and ongoing struggles. The medium has changed from clay tablets to digital screens, but the essential human need remains the same: to know who we are by remembering where we came from, and to ensure that the most valuable parts of ourselves are not lost to time but are carefully, deliberately passed on, hand to hand, generation to generation. Imagine the intense, focused silence of a Sumerian classroom, broken only by the soft scratching of style on clay. A young student, his hand cramping from hours of practice, knows that his next exercise is more than just another tablet, it's his chance to shine. The schoolmaster might soon announce a contest, a public test of skill where the best copyist or the fastest calculator would earn not just praise, but a double portion of the evening's beer ration or a coveted promotion to assist with the temple's real administrative work. This wasn't just about learning, it was about winning. From the very beginning, education and competition were intertwined, a powerful engine for motivation that was as effective as it was potentially brutal. In the Aduber, the stakes were immediate and tangible. A surviving text describes a scene where the big brother or senior student monitors the work of the younger ones, and the best performer is given a place of honor, while the others are tasked with fetching water or preparing clay. This created a clear hierarchy within the classroom itself, a microcosm of the meritocratic and often unforgiving world outside. The best scribes could look forward to a life of privilege, working directly for the palace or the temple, while those who struggled might be relegated to low-level administrative tasks or even fail to graduate at all. This system of rewards and rankings wasn't an accidental byproduct of early schooling. It was a deliberate tool to foster excellence and sort students into the roles they were deemed most fit to fill. This culture of competition evolved into more formalized spectacles in the classical world. In ancient Greece, the pedagogical focus shifted from flawless copying to persuasive speaking, and so too did the nature of the contests. Rhetoric was the supreme skill for an Athenian citizen, the key to winning debates in the assembly, arguing cases in the law courts, and gaining social influence. Schools responded by turning learning into a kind of intellectual sport. Students would engage in structured debates, or agon, on set topics, arguing opposite sides of a case to hone their quick thinking and persuasive power. The most famous of these were the rhetorical contests, where a young man's ability to sway an audience with logic, emotion, and elegant phrasing was publicly tested and judged. Success in these arenas could launch a political career, bringing fame and power to the victor and his family. The reward was no longer an extra ration of beer, but social capital and political clout, the most valuable currencies in a democracy. This competitive spirit was so deeply ingrained that it even infused their approach to physical education. The gymnasium was a place for athletic and intellectual training, both aimed at achieving arete or excellence through direct competition with one's peers. The goal was always to be the best, to stand out from the crowd, and the school was the training ground where this relentless drive was first ignited and refined. Yet for all its power to drive achievement, this system cast a long shadow of pressure and anxiety. The flip side of celebrating the winner was the inevitable creation of losers. In the strict hierarchies of the Sumerian classroom, a student's failure was not a private matter but a public humiliation, often met with the sting of the cane. The psychological weight of constantly being measured and ranked could be crushing. We get a poignant glimpse of this from a remarkable text known as Scholastic Colloquies, a dialogue between a teacher and student. The student pleads with his father to be allowed to invite the teacher to their home, hoping a bit of flattery and a generous gift might improve his standing. He fears the daily scrutiny, the constant comparison to his classmates. This ancient anxiety is hauntingly familiar, the fear of not measuring up, of disappointing one's family, of being left behind in the relentless race for success. Furthermore, this competitive framework inherently advantaged those who started with privilege. The student who didn't have to work in the fields after school, who could afford better materials, or whose family could offer a generous gift to the teacher, had a significant head start. The system, designed to reward merit, often ended up reinforcing existing social inequalities, ensuring that the children of the elite remained at the top, their success presented as a product of their superior intellect and effort rather than their advantageous starting point. The most profound and lasting innovation to emerge from this competitive environment, however, was not the prizes or the punishments, but the concept of certification itself. The early schools, by ranking and rewarding their students, were making a monumental claim that knowledge could be objectively measured, quantified, and stamped with a seal of approval. A graduate of the Aduber didn't just leave with skills, he left with an implicit and sometimes explicit certification of his ability. He was a known quantity. This was a revolutionary shift from a world where a person's skill was judged subjectively by their local community to one where an impersonal institution could vouch for their competence across the entire kingdom. This institutional certification became the key that unlocked doors. It was the ancient equivalent of a diploma or a degree, a signal to potential employers, be they kings, generals, or merchants, that this individual had undergone a standardized training and had met a certain benchmark. This system created a new form of currency, credentialed knowledge. It meant that a person's worth could be determined not just by their family name or their physical strength, but by a certified set of intellectual abilities they possessed. This ancient framework is the direct ancestor of our modern obsession with grades, standardized tests, and diplomas. The pressure to perform well on a single, high-stakes exam that determines one's future, a reality for students across the globe today, finds its roots in the rhetorical contests of Athens and the ranking systems of Mesopotamia. The SAT, the bar exam, the final university finals, all are iterations of this ancient practice of using a competitive performance to sort, rank, and certify individuals. The legacy is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provides a seemingly fair and efficient mechanism for identifying talent and allocating opportunities in complex, large-scale societies. It creates a merit-based pathway for gifted individuals from all backgrounds, at least in theory, to rise to positions of influence. On the other hand, it can reduce the rich, multifaceted process of learning to a single number or a pass/fail designation. It can prioritize the ability to test well over deeper qualities like creativity, curiosity, and critical thinking. The immense stress and the teaching to the test mentality that plagues many modern educational systems are the direct descendants of that ancient classroom anxiety, showing us that the drive to measure and rank human intelligence for all its benefits comes with a profound and enduring cost to the human spirit. For centuries, the weight of knowledge was quite literal. The clay tablet, while durable, was a profoundly limiting technology. Imagine a scholar needing to reference a legal text or a student carrying a week's worth of lessons. He wouldn't grab a stack of books. He would need a strong back and a team of porters to haul a crate of heavy, fragile clay slabs. Every word written was a physical commitment, every edit impossible without starting over. This all changed with a quiet revolution in writing surfaces, a shift from the mineral to the organic that would transform the very texture of intellectual life. The journey began along the swampy banks of the Nile, where a versatile reed called Cyprus papyrus offered a brilliant solution. The Egyptians discovered that by slicing the pith of this reed into thin strips, laying them crosswise, and then pressing, hammering, and drying them, they could create a smooth, flexible, and remarkably lightweight writing surface. This was papyrus. Suddenly, a scroll holding the equivalent of dozens of clay tablets could be carried under one's arm. A student could now own multiple texts. A government official could travel with an entire archive of documents in a single bag. The sheer convenience was revolutionary, but the impact ran far deeper. Papyrus didn't just make writing easier, it made it more expansive. The physical constraint of a small, thick clay tablet encouraged brevity. Lists, formulas, and short administrative notes fit perfectly. But grand, flowing narratives of history, complex philosophical arguments, and elaborate scientific theories needed room to breathe. The papyrus scroll provided that canvas. An author could now develop a thought across multiple feet of continuous material, creating longer, more nuanced, and structurally complex works. This technological shift directly enabled the creation of literature as we know it. The epic poems of Homer, the dialogues of Plato, the histories of Herodotus, these sprawling masterpieces of human thought, are almost unthinkable in a world of cumbersome clay. The medium itself began to shape the message, allowing ideas to unfold with a new depth and continuity that forever enriched the content of our collective memory. As the use of papyrus spread across the Mediterranean, another material was being refined, one that would prove even more durable and versatile. In the city of Pergamon, a center of learning and home to a famous library that rivaled Alexandria, a local shortage of papyrus, perhaps due to a trade embargo, spurred innovation. Artisans looked to a resource they had in abundance: animal skins. They developed an elaborate process of soaking, stretching, scraping, and drying sheep, goat, or calf skins to create a supremely tough, smooth, and beautiful writing surface known as pergamentum or parchment. Where papyrus could be brittle and prone to fraying at the edges, parchment was incredibly resilient. It could be folded, bound into books, and written on both sides. It did not crack in dry climates or dissolve in humidity. This durability made it the ultimate preservation medium. Important texts, from religious scriptures to legal contracts, could be copied onto parchment with confidence that they would survive for centuries, not just decades. This shift to a more robust material had a direct effect on the classroom. The expensive, imported papyrus scroll was often reserved for final, master copies. But parchment, though initially costly, could be reused. A student's practice exercises or temporary notes could be scribbled on a wax tablet, a cheap and erasable surface, while the precious parchment was saved for their best work or for copying essential texts. This combination of technologies, the wax tablet for draft and practice, and parchment or papyrus for the final product, created a more efficient and layered learning process. The schoolroom was no longer just about producing a single, perfect tablet. It became a workshop where ideas could be drafted, edited, and refined before being committed to a more permanent form. This mirrored a broader intellectual shift towards deeper analysis and revision, a luxury that the unforgiving medium of clay had never allowed. Perhaps the most profound effect of this revolution in writing materials was its power to gradually democratize knowledge. Clay tablets, while not exorbitant, required a certain infrastructure: sources of good clay, facilities for baking them, and significant storage space for archives. Papyrus and parchment, though valuable commodities, were ultimately more portable and required less cumbersome storage. A library of 1,000 scrolls could fit in a room. A library of 1,000 clay tablets required a warehouse. This reduction in the physical and logistical cost of storing knowledge had a trickle-down effect. While education was still largely the province of the elite, the barriers to entry were ever so slightly lowered. Smaller towns could now maintain their own modest libraries or scriptoriums. Wealthy merchants, not just kings and high priests, could begin to assemble private collections of texts. The very act of copying texts became easier and faster. A scribe could produce a longer manuscript in less time on a scroll than painstakingly impressing the same text into numerous heavy tablets. This increase in the speed of reproduction meant that copies of important works could be made and distributed more widely. Ideas could travel faster and farther. A philosophical treatise written in Athens could be copied onto papyrus scrolls and carried by ship to Alexandria, Rome, and beyond, spreading new concepts across the known world with unprecedented speed. The network of knowledge was expanding, and the nodes in that network were no longer just the great royal libraries, but also the smaller schools and private collections that were now feasible thanks to these lighter, more manageable writing technologies. This demonstrated a powerful, enduring truth that innovations in our tools for thinking are inextricably linked to advances in what we can think about. The invention of papyrus and parchment wasn't just a change in stationery. It was an upgrade to humanity's shared hard drive, one that increased its storage capacity, improved its portability, and began the long, slow process of putting that power into more and more hands. And so the echoes of those first classrooms resonate through the corridors of every modern school and university. The legacy of the ancient Aduber and the Greek academy is not a relic confined to history books. It is the very DNA of our contemporary educational system, a living foundation upon which we continue to build, often without realizing we are standing on shoulders 5,000 years old. Consider the physical space itself, the model of a single knowledgeable figure imparting wisdom to a group of seated students is a direct inheritance from the past. Our lecture halls, with their tiered seating focused on a central podium, are the architectural descendants of the shaded groves where Plato's students gathered to dialogue. The modern classroom, with its desks in rows, mirrors the orderly arrangement of scribes in a Sumerian tablet house, each student focused on their individual task under the guidance of an authority figure. This structure, designed for efficient instruction and supervision, has proven remarkably durable, reflecting an age-old understanding of how to manage the transfer of knowledge to many at once. The concept of a standardized curriculum is another profound gift from antiquity. The Sumerian lexical lists, those meticulously copied catalogues of trees, animals, and professions, were the world's first attempt to define a canonical body of knowledge that every educated person should know. Today, our mathematics textbooks, our literature anthologies, and our science standards serve the exact same purpose. They represent our society's collective decision about what is valuable to remember and pass on. The rigorous drilling in grammar and syntax that began with Panini and Dionysius Thrax is alive and well in every language arts class, where students still diagram sentences to understand the underlying architecture of thought. Even our system of diplomas and degrees is a direct evolution of the ancient practice of certification. A modern university diploma is the direct successor to the implicit credential granted to a graduate scribe. It is a formal, institutional stamp of approval that signals to the world a standardized level of mastery, a concept that began when a Sumerian schoolmaster recognized a student's flawless cuneiform. Yet perhaps the most crucial lesson from these origins lies not in what they got right, but in the inherent tensions they bequeathed to us, tensions we are still struggling to resolve. The ancient world presented us with two powerful but opposing educational models. On one hand, the Mesopotamian and Egyptian system prized precision, discipline, and the flawless preservation of existing knowledge. Its goal was stability, continuity, and the production of reliable functionaries. On the other hand, the Greek model, embodied by Socrates and Plato, valued questioning, critical thinking, and the challenging of assumptions. Its goal was personal enlightenment and the improvement of society through reasoned debate. Modern education is a constant, often uncomfortable, negotiation between these two poles. We want our students to master an established body of facts and skills, but we also want them to be innovative, creative problem solvers. We teach them to respect authority and tradition, while also encouraging them to think for themselves. This is the ancient dilemma playing out in every parent-teacher conference and every policy debate about standardized testing versus project-based learning. This legacy offers a powerful mirror for our current educational challenges. The ancient scribble schools show us the risks of over-standardization, of reducing learning to a mechanical process of memorization and repetition that can stifle creativity and enforce conformity. Their rigid hierarchies and exclusion of women remind us that education can be a powerful tool for reinforcing social inequality rather than overcoming it. Yet they also demonstrate the undeniable power of a shared, standardized knowledge base to create complex, functioning societies. Conversely, the Greek academies show us the transformative power of asking, why? But they also remind us that this kind of education was, for centuries, a luxury reserved for a privileged few. The Great Library of Alexandria stands as a timeless symbol of both the glorious potential of centralized knowledge and its terrifying fragility. For modern educators, these origins suggest a path forward that embraces the best of both worlds. a curriculum that provides a strong foundation of essential knowledge and skills, taught in a way that encourages the multidisciplinary, critical, and creative spirit of the ancient philosophers. It argues for an education that remembers its original, holistic purpose to train not just the hand of the scribe or the mind of the philosopher, but to shape the heart of the citizen and the soul of a society, understanding that how we choose to teach ultimately determines how we remember, who we are, and who we have the potential to become. Yet for all their monumental achievements, the world's first schools were far from perfect institutions. They carried within them deep and enduring flaws, contradictions that would shape the very nature of education for millennia to come, creating tensions we still grapple with today. Perhaps the most significant of these was a pedagogical model almost entirely dependent on rote learning. In the Sumerian Aduber, the goal was not understanding but perfect replication. A student's worth was measured by his ability to copy a master text without a single deviation, to internalize vast lists of words and procedures through mind-numbing repetition. This method was brilliantly effective for creating a class of highly accurate scribes, but it came at a tremendous cost to creativity and independent thought. The classroom was a factory for conformity, rewarding the student who could best mirror the past, not the one who might imagine a different future. Innovation was not just discouraged, it was often seen as a form of error, a failure to properly absorb tradition. This established a powerful precedent that would echo through history, prioritizing the preservation of existing knowledge over the creation of new ideas, and in doing so, it risked turning education into a process of intellectual embalming rather than one of intellectual growth. This culture of conformity was further enforced by the deeply ingrained elitism that defined these early systems. Education was never intended to be a universal right. It was a strategic tool for maintaining power. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, literacy was the exclusive domain of a tiny male elite, the sons of scribes, priests, and officials. This was a deliberately constructed barrier. The grueling years of study, the cost of materials, and the necessity of social connections ensured that the powerful technology of writing remained in the hands of those who could be trusted to uphold the status quo. The schools were not engines of social mobility, they were fortresses guarding the gates of privilege. This created a self-perpetuating cycle where the children of the elite received the education that qualified them for positions of power, which they then used to ensure their own children received the same advantage. The vast majority of the population, peasants, artisans, women, and slaves, were systematically excluded from this world of letters. Their knowledge, their stories, and their perspectives were deemed unworthy of preservation. The official memory of the civilization, therefore, was not a complete record of human experience, but a curated narrative written by and for the ruling class, a skewed history that would take centuries to begin to correct. Perhaps the most chilling demonstration of how education could be weaponized to suppress dissent is the trial and execution of Socrates in Athens in 399 BCE. Here was a city that prided itself on free speech and philosophical inquiry, yet it turned on its most famous thinker. Socrates' crime was not treason or violence, but the act of questioning itself. His famous method, poking holes in conventional wisdom, exposing the ignorance of those in authority, and encouraging the youth to think for themselves, was deemed too dangerous, too corrosive to the established order. His accusers charged him with impiety and corrupting the youth, but his real offense was intellectual disobedience. The Athenian state, for all its democratic ideals, ultimately showed that it valued stability and conformity over the messy, unpredictable pursuit of truth. The death sentence for Socrates stands as an eternal warning. Even societies that champion education can fear its consequences when it challenges deep-seated beliefs and power structures. It reveals the dark side of the educational project, the potential for institutions of learning to become instruments of ideological control, punishing those who dare to think too differently. This impulse to control knowledge through censorship and destruction is a tragic recurring theme in the history of learning. The burning of books is its most potent symbol. While the famous destruction of the Library of Alexandria was likely a gradual process of neglect and accidental fires during various conflicts, other episodes were terrifyingly deliberate. In 213 BC, the Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huang, in his quest to unify thought and erase history, ordered the burning of all books except those on practical subjects like medicine and agriculture. He sought to create a clean slate, a population that would remember only the state-sanctioned narrative. Centuries later, in Mayan and Spanish colonial histories, we see the deliberate destruction of countless codices to eradicate indigenous knowledge and religious beliefs. These acts are more than just vandalism. They are attempts to commit intellectual genocide, to sever a people from their past and their identity by destroying the externalized memory that holds it all together. They show us that the power to preserve knowledge is always shadowed by the power to destroy it, and that education can be a battleground where the fight over what is remembered and what is forgotten is brutally contested. Recognizing these profound flaws, the stifling rigidity, the systemic exclusion, and the occasional brutality, is not to diminish the incredible achievements of the first schools. Instead, it completes the picture, reminding us that reinventing human knowledge is not a single event but a continuous, messy, and often conflicted process. These early institutions gave us the tools to build civilization, but they also handed us the blueprint for its potential injustices. They showed us that education can be a ladder for human advancement, but also a wall to keep people out. It can be a light for discovering truth, but also a weapon for enforcing dogma. This dual nature is their most crucial legacy. It teaches us that the work of education is never finished. It requires constant reflection, reform, and a vigilant commitment to ensuring that the systems we create to expand the human mind do not end up confining it. The goal is not to perfect a static model, but to engage in an ongoing struggle to make learning a force that truly liberates human potential for everyone, a process of remembering that is as inclusive, creative, and courageous as the human spirit itself. And just as the scribes of Sumer pressed their styluses into clay, forever changing the relationship between thought and time, we now find ourselves at the precipice of another equally profound transformation. The digital revolution is not merely a shift in technology. It is a fundamental reinvention of human memory and cognition, echoing the seismic change that occurred 5,000 years ago when knowledge first leaped from the mind onto the page. Today, our externalized memory no longer resides on clay or parchment, but in the vast, ethereal realm of the cloud, a digital library of unimaginable scale that is accessible from a device in our pocket. This is the new Great Library of Alexandria, but one that is infinitely larger, instantly searchable, and globally distributed. Where the ancient scribe worked for years to master a few hundred cuneiform signs, we now interface with artificial intelligences that can process and generate language with a fluency that borders on the human, effectively creating a new kind of collaborative partner in the pursuit of knowledge. This shift is every bit as disruptive as the invention of writing itself, forcing us to ask the same existential questions our ancestors faced. What does it mean to know something when the sum total of human information is a quick search away? Are we offloading our cognitive capacities, or are we freeing our minds to engage in higher forms of creativity and analysis? The parallels are striking. Just as the first schools systematized knowledge for the sake of administrative control, our digital platforms algorithmically curate information, creating new hierarchies of truth and influence. The ancient fear that writing would weaken memory, as voiced by Socrates, finds its modern counterpart in concerns about digital amnesia. The tendency to forget information we know is stored externally on a server. This is not the death of memory, but its latest evolution, a transition from individual recall to a form of networked, transactive memory where we remember less the information itself and more the path to retrieve it. This new system offers breathtaking opportunities for global collaboration and access, dissolving the geographic and economic barriers that once kept knowledge locked away in ivory towers and elite institutions. A student in a remote village can now access the same lectures, the same primary sources, and the same research tools as a professor at a world-renowned university, democratizing learning in ways the ancient scholars could never have dreamed. Yet this incredible abundance brings its own set of perils. The information overload we now face is a cognitive challenge unlike any other. A constant deluge of data that can overwhelm our capacity for deep, sustained thought and critical discernment. The ancient library had gatekeepers, scribes, and scholars who decided what was worthy of preservation. Our digital universe often lacks such curation, allowing misinformation to spread with the same velocity as fact, challenging the very foundations of a shared reality. The risk is that we become broad but shallow, connected but not necessarily wise, possessing a wealth of information but a poverty of attention. Navigating this new landscape requires us to become the modern equivalents of those first critical thinkers in the academy, cultivating a new form of digital literacy that prioritizes skepticism, source evaluation, and the ability to synthesize vast amounts of information into coherent understanding. We are living through the great rewiring of human intelligence, and the choices we make now about how we design these systems, how we teach people to use them, and what we choose to value will echo for millennia, just as the choices of those ancient Mesopotamian administrators did. This perspective places us not at the end of history, but as active participants in the latest chapter of a very old story, one that began in a mud brick room with a wet clay tablet and a determined teacher. We are the inheritors of that first great experiment in externalizing memory, and now we have the privilege and the responsibility to shape its next incredible iteration. So as we've seen, the journey from whispered stories around a fire to the organized classrooms of the ancient world was far more than just a shift in how people learned. It was a revolution in human consciousness itself. The world's first schools didn't simply teach skills, they fundamentally reinvented what it meant to know and to remember. They transformed knowledge from something fluid, personal, and perishable into a durable, shared resource that could be built upon across generations. Through the invention of writing, they gave us a way to externalize memory, to hold our thoughts outside of ourselves in clay, stone, and papyrus. Through the development of rigorous curricula, they created a standardized body of wisdom that could be reliably passed on. And through the establishment of formal institutions, they built the structures that made this great project of collective learning possible. This was the monumental gift of the Aduber, the temple school, and the academy. They turned the flickering, individual candle of human understanding into a lasting beacon that could light the way forward for all of civilization. The enduring impact of this shift is all around us, woven into the very fabric of our modern world. Our systems of law, with their reliance on written statutes and precedents, are direct descendants of the legal codes first drafted by scribes in Mesopotamia. The scientific method, with its emphasis on observation, record-keeping, and building upon past discoveries, has its roots in the meticulous practices of Egyptian physicians and Babylonian astronomers. Our very sense of cultural identity, shaped by foundational texts and shared historical narratives, was forged in the classrooms where epics like Gilgamesh and the Iliad were copied and preserved. Even our personal growth is shaped by this ancient legacy, the idea that we can improve ourselves through study, that reasoning and critical thought are paths to a better life, is a philosophy handed down to us from the dialogues of Socrates and the teachings of Confucius. Every time we open a book, attend a lecture, or trust in a written contract, we are benefiting from a system of knowledge preservation that is thousands of years old, a system invented in those first pioneering centers of learning. This long view of history makes one thing abundantly clear: education remains our most powerful tool for preserving not just information, but wisdom. It is the engine of human progress and the guardian of our collective memory. The challenges we face today, navigating the digital deluge, combating misinformation, bridging divides of inequality, are in many ways new versions of ancient struggles over how knowledge is stored, shared, and controlled. The story of the first schools teaches us that these are not just technical problems, but human ones. It reminds us that the form of our education shapes the content of our thought, and that who is included in the classroom determines what is remembered by the culture. The solution to our modern challenges, then, may lie in reconnecting with the deepest purpose of those ancient institutions, not just to train people for jobs, but to cultivate thoughtful, ethical citizens equipped to steward our shared world wisely. This is a legacy worth not only appreciating, but actively building upon. We can honor it by supporting initiatives that break down barriers to education, ensuring that the powerful tools of learning are in as many hands as possible. We can engage in our own lifelong learning, embracing the idea that the pursuit of knowledge is a never-ending journey that enriches our lives and strengthens our communities. And we can consciously apply the lessons of the past to the technologies of the future, ensuring that our new tools for thinking amplify human wisdom rather than replace it. The first schools show us that every generation has the opportunity and the responsibility to contribute to humanity's great conversation across time. We are all inheritors of this incredible story, and now it is our turn to add to it. What do you think the ancient schools can teach us about our modern educational challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your perspectives. And if you enjoyed this journey into how we learn to remember, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more explorations into the mysteries of our shared past.